Today's lesson is about the reasons for Confederation. At this point, you should have downloaded the worksheet that goes along with this. Please make sure that you are also filling in the blue lines so that you can have a full set of notes. For each of these, there are also a set of questions that I expect you to answer and upload. This will be a complete, incomplete response, and there is an essay at the end. Let's get going. Let's do a little bit of background. So I don't want you to think that from the time of the end of the War of 1812 that nothing happened in Canada until Confederation. In fact, the Selkirk settlers arrived in 1812 in what is the area now called Winnipeg. This started a turf war between the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. You've done a lot of work on this in A Brief History of the Red River. The two companies merged in 1821, and the arrival of the settlers established an agricultural and European presence in Rupert's Land. In 1837, in Upper and Lower Canada, places we now know today as Ontario and Quebec, there were not one but two popular rebellions. In Lower Canada, that's the French part, the people were worried about the changing laws that threatened their way of life. The British majority was making a bunch of laws that it favored the British culture, the British language, and the British way of doing things, whereas the French people were largely agricultural, and they wanted to keep it that way. So they rebelled to protect the French language and cultural rights. Ultimately, they were rebelling to keep things the same. In Upper Canada, however, the population was becoming increasingly educated and more opinionated. Therefore, they resented the power of the church to influence lawmaking, so they wanted a separation of church and state. But they also really hated the idea that only the wealthy could vote. So they rebelled for two reasons. One was to separate church and state, and the other was for greater democracy. Now, please understand, they didn't mean democracy for everybody. They just meant that they wanted men to be allowed to vote. Not just rich men. So, on your sheets, summarize the following. How do the two reasons for the rebellions differ? When you answer a question like this, you need to deal with both sides. So, in your answer, what was the reason for the Upper Canada Rebellion? What was the reason for the Lower Canada Rebellion? Durham's Report. Now, in 1837, Queen Victoria had just taken the throne, and she was absolutely shocked that her colonists had rebelled. Now, for Queen Victoria, she could have, had she been any other monarch, would have sent out more British troops, and they would have simply quelled the rebellion, and that would have been the end of it. However, she was in a bit of a different situation. She was not meant to be the queen. She was meant to marry a king somewhere else in Europe. However, her uncle, the king, died without, well, his son had died, so she was next in line. So with only 2 years' warning, she was thrust from the position of future wife of a king to now being the head of Great Britain. As such, she wasn't trained in the standard how to be a monarch thing, and so instead she became very upset at the idea that her colonists had rebelled. And her upset was not about how dare they, but rather about what's wrong. Why are my citizens rebelling? So she sent Lord Durham to Canada to investigate. Now, Durham was a rather unfortunate choice because he was, well, he was racist. He hated the French. So he only stayed 5 months in Canada. But he made two very important recommendations. The first was that Upper and Lower Canada should be joined in one royal province. So in 1840, the Act of Union created the Royal Province of Canada. However, it was such a large area, they still had to split it up. They now called the two parts Canada East and Canada West. So Canada East is the old Lower Canada, Canada West is the old Upper Canada. The second recommendation was responsible government, and that means that government is responsible to the people. In other words, an elected government, not an appointed one. And in 1848, responsible government was granted to the province of Canada. This is the very beginnings of Canada's democracy. So, please summarize. At the beginning of the section, I told you the story of Queen Victoria hearing about the Canadian rebellions. So on your notes sheet, please explain, why did Queen Victoria not simply send in British troops to overwhelm the rebellions? The American Civil War also occurred during this time. It's 1861 to 1865. Now, this war seemed to be about freeing the slave, but the basis of the war was actually economic. The agricultural southern states, remember, mostly they grew cotton, felt that their needs and interests were being ignored in favor of the more industrial and wealthy northern states. In other words, all the laws, all the things that were changing to favor what was happening up in the north, and the South was getting left further and further behind. The southern states therefore threatened to secede from the Union. They were going to create their own country. The northern states, not happy about that. Remember, manifest destiny, right? So the North decided that if they were to free the slaves, then the southern economy would collapse, because of course the whole agricultural basis was on slavery. Without the slaves, the agriculture simply would not be able to exist. Therefore, the threat of secession would disappear. So, how does all of this lead to Confederation? Well, there was a bunch of military reasons. The first is that as a colony, Britain controlled where and how the colony would be defended. So the argument was made that if they were their own country, they could raise their own army and protect themselves where and how they saw fit. The British, therefore all the British colonies, had supported the southern states during the Civil War, which is kind of weird. They didn't support slavery, they'd abolished it, but they still supported the southern states. Why? Because they needed cotton. Remember all those sheep that were the reason that the Scottish people had been kicked out of Scotland? Yeah, well, those sheep were owned by textile mill owners. Well, those textile mills also needed cotton, and they didn't have enough that they were growing in other parts, and they needed to buy it from the southern United States. So they supported the southern states. So much so, and now I'm going to come into the robbers of St. Albans here, so much so that when a group of Confederate soldiers decided that a good way to raise money for the Southern Army was to rob northern banks, they went into some of the northern states, and they actually did. They robbed banks, and they robbed one in a place called St. Albans. However, the American military had found out that this was going to happen, and they closed all the roads and exit ports. So the robbers could not get back down south. So instead, they went north to Canada. The American government asked the Canadian government to please arrest these people and send them back to the United States. Well, we arrested them all right, but then we did something really stupid. We put them on trial here in Canada. So they were put on trial in Montreal, and not only, we had no jurisdiction. So not only were we trying people that were not our citizens for a crime that was not committed in our country, but we tried them anyway, And on top of that, we found them not guilty and gave them back the money. And then put them on a ship, a British ship, and sent the British ship around to the southern United States so that the money could actually be returned to them. You can imagine that the Americans were absolutely incensed by this. Then there were the Fenians. Now, the Fenians were a group of Irish Americans who had this phenomenal idea. It's amazing how much, how good an idea can seem after you've had a few shots of whiskey in you. And I say that quite literally because most of their meetings did take place in various pubs. These Fenians had the idea that they wanted to free Ireland from the clutches of Great Britain. And so what they were going to do is they were going to capture Canada, and then they would offer to swap it. So we'll give you back Canada if you free Ireland, was essentially the plan. To this end, the Fenians launched several small, disorganized raids along the border between Canada and the United States. Really not a major threat, but it certainly did get played up by the pro-Confederationists. But they were a thorn in the side, but not really that dangerous. So, why would the pro-Confederationists exaggerate the threat posed by the Fenian Brotherhood? All right, at this point, I'm almost out of time on this, so I am going to pause here and upload this one. Don't get rid of your notes. We're going to carry on from here, but you will have to download a second video. All right? I'll be right back.